Imagine a quiet evening, the lights dim, the breeze gently swaying the curtains, and the crackling of the fire in the fireplace echoing like the ancient breaths of time. In that moment, you are no longer yourself, but a traveler walking slowly into the distant past, where snow covers the thatched roofs and the rustling of old pine trees weaves through the cold mountains. The deep voice invites you to close your eyes, letting your imagination take you through the centuries to the land of the Vikings. A wild, harsh, but majestic world where glory and death always go hand in hand like two swords intertwined with light. In that place, it is not only men who sing in epics. There are women who have broken the mold, left the loom, put down the needle and thread donned armor, and entered the ranks of warriors. They are the Shieldmaidens, female warriors who carry shields, not to challenge anyone, but simply because their blood flows with the desire to live fully under the gaze of the gods. That question quietly rises like a whisper, the threshold of sleep. If you were born in the Viking era, under the cold but fair gaze of the Norse gods, would you have the courage to reject peace and take up sword and shield? Would you choose glory amid the rain of arrows, or accept your life as a faint thread in someone else's fabric? In that world, choices do not just write fate. They are carved in stone to be told forever on long winter nights by the flickering fire when the wind still echoes from the far north. In the harsh winter of 863, when the wind howled like a wolf through the northern forests and the snow covered the mountain paths, a child cried for the first time in the air, filled with wood smoke and the strong scent of herbs inside an oak longhouse. Outside, the storm raged relentlessly. The sky seemed to be pouring down the wrath of the gods, and inside, a woman struggled between life and death to bring a new soul into the world. That person was Sigrid the Archer, who was once famous for her sharp eyes and unwavering arms even in the blizzard. Lying on her animal skin, sweat soaked her tangled hair. She did not groan, only clenched her fists and gritted her teeth like a warrior giving her all for the final battle. Bjorn Ironside. Her husband stood beside her like a statue, his rough hand still clutching his spear, as if ready to rush into battle at any moment. Though a renowned warrior having returned from many distant voyages, his eyes now held a hint of human helplessness and anxiety. He had prayed to Freya, the goddess of love and war, and to Frigg, the goddess of family. But deep in his heart, he still hoped that the child about to be born would be a boy, someone who would continue the long line of warriors in his family. In the flickering darkness of the fire, a vulva, an old witch with silver hair and a gaze that seemed to pierce fate, was lighting incense and burning mugwort and juniper berries to ward off evil spirits and open the way for the child to enter the world. When the child finally cried, it was not a faint sound, but an arrow piercing the snow so strong and powerful that the longhouse fell silent for a moment. The midwife held up the baby's red, wet body, and when she said, "A girl," the house fell silent. No one laughed. No one burst into laughter. There was only the sound of Bjorn's slow footsteps approaching, but before he could say anything, the vulva spoke again, her voice shaking like the wind on the thatched roof. "This child bears the mark of the Valkyrie." She pointed to a small birthmark on her right shoulder, a blurry but symbolic shape like Odin's spear, Gungnir. The house held its breath, for the vulva's words were never empty words. Those who bore the mark of the Valkyrie, according to the old belief, belonged not to the loom or the kitchen, but to the front lines where shield touched shield, where life and death were separated by a breath. Bjorn said nothing, but bent down his hands, accustomed to gripping the hilt of his sword, surprisingly gentle as he took the child. He walked to the center of the room, raised his head and held the child up near the smoke hole in the ceiling that opened to the gray sky, as if offering his child to the gods. Above the green and purple lights of the aurora borealis, the lights the Norse believed were the skirts of the Valkyries flowed like divine silk. The father had hoped for a son, but in that moment his hope turned to admiration. He announced that his daughter's name, an old but majestic name, was taken from his mother, a woman who had once stood with her husband on the battlefield and had killed the man who had almost killed him. In the first breath in the bitter cold of the snow, and in the silent gaze of the wooden walls that have witnessed so many stories for generations, a new legend began. Not with an oath, not with a sword, but with the first cry of a girl born, not to live quietly, but to carve her name into the pages of the saga, burning with the fire of time. Her childhood was not like that of the other children in the village. While the other girls sat around the fire, skillfully braiding the hair of their hay dolls, she would stare at her father's armory, where the axe blade reflected the firelight, where the sword longer than she was tall glowed with a silent light, as if it contained something very secret, very alive. She paid no attention to the soft dolls or the embroidered cloths, but felt her heart beat faster when she saw the spear, the bow and arrows and the chipped shield that her father had brought back from the battle last year. When she was 5 on a morning when the mist was thin, she crept up to her father's sword and tried to lift it with her small hands. The sword was silent heavy and clearly beyond her strength. But instead of being scolded, she heard her father's deep laughter from behind. He did not get angry, but instead bent down and handed her a special gift. A wooden knife he had carved himself, the hilt of ash, polished to a watery sheen. "Still too heavy for you, little Valkyrie," he said, calling her by the nickname the village had begun to use. She took the knife in both hands as if it were her first real sword, a silent acknowledgement that her chosen path was not rejected. It just needed time to mature. On long winter nights when the wind howled outside the longhouse and the snow pounded on the roof, her mother Sigrid would sit and brush her hair with an old horn comb, smoothing the wheat-colored strands as she told stories of Hervor, the brave girl who had found and brought her father's cursed sword from the graveyard. She told stories of Lagertha, the warrior who had fought alongside Ragnar, who would bow to no king. Not bedtime stories with princesses and magic, but the heroic tales that no one taught to children unless you were the daughter of an archer and a warrior. She learned to swim in water so cold it hurt her lungs to hold her breath to surface and dive as if the water were an enemy to be conquered. She climbed trees to retrieve bird nests, shot arrows with her brother from the fence at a target set in a birch tree, and learned to close her eyes and listen to the sound of falling leaves to determine the direction of the wind. But she was also good at everyday tasks, sweeping ashes from the fireplace, fetching water from the well, feeding the chickens, and helping her mother mend the tears in her winter coat. She was never lazy. There was just an unnamed energy always urging her to do more than a little girl should, as if the universe were preparing her for something bigger ahead. One day as the snow began to melt and mud filled the courtyards, a skald, a wandering poet, came to the village. His face was as hard as an old statue, his calloused hands clutching a small harp, as he sang of a warrior woman who had compelled Odin to disguise himself and watch her battle. When the song ended, he looked around. Then his eyes fell on the girl, crouched in the crowd, her eyes wide, her hands clutching a wooden knife. "I see the threads of fate in you," he said, his voice like the wind through the rocks. "One day Odin himself will have to witness your footsteps on the battlefield." The adults laughed, thinking it was just the minstrel's embellishment, but the girl believed. Her 8th winter was no fairy tale. The barley did not grow, the fish did not come in. She spent days on end without food, sleep interrupted by the rumbling of her stomach. The old grew visibly weaker. The children cried, then fell silent. Some did not live to see spring. But it was in her hunger that she learned a lesson that the sword could not teach. Survival came not from strength alone, but from solidarity. Those who could not fight sewed, stood watch, and kept the fire going. She learned to split a turnip into 3 to stack the firewood, so that it burned longer, to keep her heart warm with hope, even when the wind stung her chest like a needle. And so, amidst hunger and cold, amidst lessons of blood and love, her childhood quietly forged a soul of steel. There was no sound of drums or triumph. There was only the sound of wind, the sound of fire, her mother's whispers, her father's laughter, and the steady, slow, steady beat of her heart, like an ancient drum echoing from her bones. It was the childhood of a warrior without armor, but already beginning to carry a shield in her mind. At the age of 9, when most girls in this village had already begun learning to weave, make bedding, and prepare for family life, she stepped out of her home's doorway to begin a journey unlike any other. Not a journey in search of tender love, but a journey in search of strength, discipline, and a steely will, things usually reserved for men. The first day she stood at the edge of the training ground, where the older boys were sweating to the shouts of their masters, strange eyes were fixed on her, surprised, skeptical, a little contemptuous, as if the presence of a girl there was something against the natural order of the world. But her father, Bjorn Ironside, did not let the silence last. He stepped forward, his voice like a drum pounding into the earth. "My daughter shall bear the sword. She bears the mark of the Valkyrie. The sword shall be her path." No one dared to contradict the man. His trophies were still engraved on every shield that hung in the great hall. And so, with a single word, he gave his daughter not only the opportunity, but the burden of proving it right. Training began without exception, without favors, without sympathetic nods to weakness. Master Hakon, a one-eyed stone-cold old man who never smiled or spoke more than 3 words at a time, was the first to toss her a wooden sword and command, "Stand up." She was not taught how to fight, but how to fall properly, how to keep her balance, how to breathe evenly, so as not to collapse in the middle of a fight. Before you can kill, you must learn to stand without falling, he said. And that was the philosophy that began a long journey. Day after day, her hands blistered and calloused, her knees bruised and healed. Her back ached so much she could barely sit still at dinner, but she never complained. Before the sun rose, she ran along the bay, breathing heavily in the cold mist, training her legs to be strong. When the moon rose high, she practiced wielding the heavy sword, trying to steady her shield with arms that trembled with fatigue. Each movement was repeated hundreds of times until she no longer needed to think, her body responding automatically like a living machine forged of iron and will. She learned to wield a sword, not just to stab, but to wait for the moment when her enemy was vulnerable. She learned to wield an axe, not as a tool for chopping wood, but as an extension of her body, able to spin in the air, finding weak spots in heavy armor. She learned to wield a spear, not to stab randomly, but to keep her distance to protect her comrades behind her. And she learned to use a knife, a close-quarters weapon requiring speed and courage, because using a knife means you are on the edge of life and death. But the lesson that made her grow the most came not from weapons, but from blindness. One autumn morning, Haken bound her eyes with a black cloth, tied it so tightly that she could no longer feel the light, and dropped her in the middle of the training ground. In battle, blood and smoke can blind you. Learn to hear with your skin, see with your ears. He circled her, his footsteps as light as falling leaves. And then the first blow came as light as a tap on the shoulder, but enough for him to say, "You are dead." The second time, dead, and then again, dead. Each time she failed, anger rose like fire in her chest. And then after so many imaginary deaths, she began to feel the wind, the sound of boots rubbing against dry leaves, the breath of her attacker that was off by a split second. When the day ended, she had blocked 3 consecutive blows. He nodded silently. In that nod was the first recognition, small but more valuable than all the praise in the world. The boys who had laughed at her no longer dared to do so. They did not say so, but the look in their eyes changed, wary, then curious, then respectful. Of them, Leif, the son of a shipwright, 2 years her senior, was the only one who never pretended to be gentle in training. He hit her, knocked her down, and when she fell, he reached out to pick her up without a word of pity. "When we grow up," he said during one practice, "we'll go to war together. People will write sagas about us." She did not laugh, but simply replied, "If they do, they'll write about me first." And then it was she who knocked Leif down a moment later. It was the first stage of her becoming a warrior, not because she knew how to hold a weapon, but because she learned to endure pain, to overcome her limits, and to believe in herself. She was no longer the little girl who played with wooden knives. She was an iron shoot forged by fire, by her father's teachings, by Haken's silent nods, and by her mother's watchful eyes from afar. The woman who had once drawn her bow on the wooden ramparts during the siege, now silently rubbing medicine on the red, swollen wounds on her daughter's hands, saying nothing, just to let her daughter know she was not alone in this journey. One gloomy morning in early spring, when the ground was still cold and the clouds hung low, threatening to swallow the sky, the girl was practicing with the boys as usual. The wooden sword was still heavy, her shoulder still aching from the blows of the day before, but her mind was preoccupied with something else. A small, unexpected stain of blood seeping through the dark, rough fabric of her pants. Her body felt different, as if an invisible door had opened silently. But along with that change, a vague fear arose in her heart. Would this blood make others see her as a girl, or as someone no longer worthy of standing in the circle of warriors? She was afraid of the boys' eyes, afraid of their hidden laughter, afraid of the master's head shaking, afraid of herself, when she had to face her body that was growing day by day in a way that was not like a warrior's. And then, as usual, Leif was the first to notice. He did not mock, did not ask awkward questions. He just gently approached, lowered his voice, and said in her ear, "My mother said that women's blood is a gift from Freya. It is not weakness, it is power. It carries life, and if necessary, death for the enemy." That sentence short was like a gentle arrow piercing through the thick layer of doubt in her heart. Not everyone understood, but at least one person did. And for a young warrior, just a trusting look was enough to keep the sword steady. Fate soon put her to her first real test. One summer morning, while her father and most of the village's warriors were out at sea on a far-flung raid disaster struck. Horns sounded in panic. The enemy, a raiding party from a neighboring tribe, had breached the village's defenses and stormed straight into the village. For a moment, chaos reigned. Women, old men and children ran, but she did not. Her mother, with her bow as old but still as sharp as ever, quickly took up her position on the watchtower. Through the smoke and screams, she turned to her daughter and said only 4 words: "Remember and fight." Not an order, not a test, just an affirmation that if anyone survived today, it would be in part thanks to the years of practice that had forged that little hand. She took up her sayax, her practice-worn combat knife, and ran toward the sound of clashing steel. It was like a dream in the mist. A foe charged from behind the ruined house. He was a large man, with a beard and an axe in his hand. His eyes were filled with contempt, only when he recognized her as a young woman. But in that moment, as he swung the axe high and exposed his side, she did not think. She did not hesitate. She did not hesitate. She leaned, avoiding the blow, then brought the knife up, stabbing deep under his ribs, where his flesh was soft and careless. Hot blood welled up, spilled over her wrist, stained the hilt, and his eyes changed color from arrogance to shock, then died like a dying flame. There was no time to fear, no moment to tremble. She fought on, moving as Haken had taught her, taking a step back, turning her shoulder, exploiting every blind spot. The battle dragged on until the last of the invaders were driven back, dragging their own casualties in their wake, retreating in disarray, taking the nightmare they had sown with them. As night fell, she sat alone by the shore of the bay, where the black water reflected the stars. She soaked the blood-dried knife in the cold water, her hands still shaking, not from fear, but from the clear awareness that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. They say that killing someone changes you forever. She didn't know if she had truly changed, only that her heart still beat, her eyes still saw clearly, but deep down something had quietly disappeared. Something young, innocent, replaced by a layer of steel forged in blood. When her father returned a few days later and heard about the attack and who had led the defense, he did not say a word at first. During the victory celebration, amid the clinking of glasses and the sound of instruments, he stood up, raised his mead cup high, and announced to the village, "My daughter has taken up arms and shed her blood to defend this place. From this day forward, she is no longer a child. She is the shield maiden of my family, of this entire village." The recognition came not as thunder, but as a quiet dream whispered in the night. A girl who had sharpened her knife by the firelight now had a place among the warriors, not because of her bloodline, not because of her prophecy, but because it was the hand that held the shield, the blade that pierced the enemy. And because once she had walked into the fire and not been burned. After a brutal winter and a bloody first battle, the young girl, now a recognized warrior, prepares to embark on an ancient, sacred, and challenging rite of passage, the coming of age of a shield maiden. There is no noisy party, no congratulations, no gifts of gold or silver. It is an inner journey, a transformation not of words, but of silence, pain, and will. The ritual began with 3 days of fasting in the sweat lodge, a low stone hut lined with dried herbs and covered with animal skins located on the edge of the forest. Each morning, red-hot stones were brought into the center of the hut, and water poured over them, creating a suffocating steam. She sat there sweating like a river, her body growing weak, but her mind floating in a state between dream and wakefulness. No longer hungry, no longer tired, only the breath and whispers of the earth of the ancestors. And sometimes, or perhaps it was just a vision, the faint song of the Valkyries at the end of her sleep. In that misty trance, she saw images of a raven flying across a fiery sky, a wolf walking beside her without biting, and a shield broken in the hands of a young girl and mended with light. No one explained these dreams to her, and no one needed to. What happened in the lodge was hers alone, her personal mark on the path to becoming a warrior. When she emerged from the sweat lodge on the morning of the 4th day, the sun was high, and the light seemed sharper, as if the world had noticed the change in her. Her face was haggard, but her eyes were strangely bright, and she was led into the sacred forest, where the Volva were waiting. On a flat, moss-covered stone were the ancient tattooing tools, needles carved from bone and ink made from cypress ash, and sacred animal blood. For hours she lay motionless, not whimpering, not trembling, as the needles touched her skin. Each spiral, each ancient rune appeared covering her forearms and shoulders, symbols of protection, of strength, of the bond between the living and the spirits of the ancestors. It was not just a tattoo, but a letter to the gods. I am ready. Finally, at sunset, the village gathered before the great longhouse. She emerged not wearing a silk dress or jade bracelets, but a simple dark woolen dress, her neatly braided hair revealing fresh ink stains that glistened in the sunlight like beautiful curses. Her father, who had raised her to the gods at birth, came forward with a carved oak box. He opened the lid, revealing a real sword, a Nordic forged steel blade, thin but strong, with a wave pattern running down the blade, a leather strap around the hilt, and a small amber stone embedded in the hilt, a stone that had belonged to her grandmother, the first warrior of her family. This sword, he said, his voice low and slow, as the memory itself, is the promise of our family. It is not only for taking lives, but also for keeping promises, for upholding justice. It does not choose its wielder, but waits for the worthy. Today, I give it to you. She held out her arms to receive it as gently as if she were holding a soul, then stood up straight, holding the sword close to her heart. Without anyone needing to say it, everyone understood. She was no longer the girl with the wooden knife of years past, but a warrior. A true shield maiden standing on par with the men whose names were engraved in the sagas. As the ceremony wound down amid the sounds of laughter and the smell of roasting meat, Leif approached her. He was taller than before, his features now marked by the traces of a man who had sailed and returned alive. He brought no gifts, nor did he offer any flowery words. He simply said, "My father is building a new ship. When spring comes, it will sail west. I have secured a place for you on board. You will come with us if you wish." She looked at him then, at the sword in her hand, the steel glinting in the firelight, and knew that this was an invitation to the next chapter of her life. No longer about training, no longer about protecting the village, but about conquering, exploring, and writing her own story in a foreign land. And so, as night fell and the stars returned to their usual place in the sky, she closed her eyes, the sword still by her pillow, her hands still warm with the ink that had not yet healed. Her heart was not anxious, not afraid, but only murmured a strange melody, the first song of a warrior about to set sail. The long winter had finally melted away, and the thin rays of early spring sunlight fell gently on the deep blue water. It was then that the new ship, the Vogusk or wave cutter, completed after months of construction, appeared before her like a sleeping sea beast waiting to be awakened by the first beat of a war drum. The hull was long and sturdy, made of oak and pine, its prow carved with the head of a roaring dragon, and its sides were lined with interwoven round shields. Inside, 40 warriors stood ready, and among them only one was a woman. She. No one forbade her, but their eyes were still scrutinizing, half believing. They did not say it out loud, but every movement, every breath contained a silent question. Can she hold out? However, no one dared to doubt her in front of her, especially after the coming-of-age ceremony, after being given the sword engraved with her name in runes, and after being recognized as a true warrior by her father, a man who was not easily swayed. When she stepped onto the deck, leather armor lightly clasped around her shoulders, her hair-braided sword strapped to her waist shield, bearing the family crest on her back. She was not an exception, but part of the warriors. The first days at sea were a silent and harsh test. Strong winds whipped at her face, the salt dried into white streaks on her skin, and her muscles had to get used to rowing for oars under the steady beat of a drum. She slept on the cold deck at night with no mattress or blanket, just a thin fur coat and the steady sound of waves lapping against the hull. She did not complain, did not ask for leave, did not let anyone else take the blame. Every morning, she still rose early to check her sword, dry the blade, and practice her moves quietly on the stern. Her silence was not weakness. It was the voice of perseverance. On the 6th day, the seagull appeared as a gray sky. The land was visible like an ink blot on the ocean. The commander gunner Broadbeard signaled to assemble the crew. Ahead was a monastery perched on a rocky outcrop, said to be rich and guarded by gentle monks who believed their one god would protect them. "We attack at sunrise," Gunner said, his voice rough. "Bring back the spoils before emotions get in the way. Gold first, then prisoners. Whoever takes what is not worth, it will pay." That night she couldn't sleep, not because she was afraid, but because her heart was as tense as an unstrung bowstring. This was no longer practice. This was real blood, real screams, real death. And if she made one wrong move, she might never come back. Dawn broke the light soft, but cold, like a freshly sharpened knife. Vogus came ashore in silence. The bow of the ship pressed into the gravel, and the war cry rose like thunder. She dove into the water, her legs numb with cold, but her body more awake than ever. She dashed ashore, sword unsheathed, shield raised, running through the thin smoke of the monastery, which had just awakened with alarm. The fight didn't last long. The monks weren't warriors, but they weren't easy to beat. Some fought back with crosses, some tried to hide in the sheds, and one, his eyes burning with determination, came at her with a kitchen knife. For a moment, she stopped thinking. She parried with her shield, ducked under a stab, and then countered with a clean cut, straight, clean, and decisive. The man fell without a sound. Blood gushed from his chest, dark as thick mead. She stared not in horror, but with a quietness that spread through her. She had done the undoable. When the trumpet sounded to end the battle, she found herself standing in the middle of the abbey courtyard, breathing heavily. Her hand still gripping the hilt of her sword, her armor smeared with blood and dust, her eyes stinging from the smoke. In her hand, it was no longer the sword of a girl practicing. It was a real tool, washed in blood with a soul. When the army returned, their ships were laden with booty gold and silver precious books, exquisitely carved statues, and even bound prisoners destined to serve as slaves in the noble houses of the North. She brought back few material goods, but on her hand she carried a silver ring, a reward from Gunnar himself, a symbol of a warrior's achievement. She did not ask, did not bargain. She simply reached out to receive it. It was a silent act, but it echoed like thunder in her heart. From that day on, no one called her daughter of Bajorn. She had her own name, her own achievements, her own looks of genuine respect from those who had doubted her. In the twilight of her return, as the village lit fires to welcome her, as the mead flowed from her goblets, as the stories began to flow, with the sound of legend she sat quietly in the stern, stroking her sword, looking out into the distance. For she knew that this was only the beginning, and that a warrior's dream does not end with the first victory, but begins with it, like the first flame of a long night that burns forever. After years of fighting, her name was no longer heard in the war cry, but whispered respectfully around the fires of old storytellers. They called her Horsefell, not with superficial admiration, but with the kind of respect reserved for those who have looked death in the eye and returned with clear eyes. In a fierce battle, when the enemy cavalry was thundering down, she did not retreat. One turn, one steady stroke of the sword, and the lead stallion fell, taking the proud leader with it. It was not just a moment of life and death, but a defining moment. From then on, Horsefell became a symbol, a woman who dared to face what no woman could defeat. Her fame spread like incense on the north wind, taking her to places where women had never been allowed to enter before, including the tribal council, where decisions about land, war, and law were made. No woman had ever dared to stand in that circle of men, let alone speak. But she didn't ask permission. She was invited. And when she stood up, her hair tied back, her eyes calm, her voice deep and clear, the council fell silent. She didn't argue loudly. She didn't use her fame to intimidate. She spoke with reason, with real experience, with a deep understanding of what kept a community alive through winter, through war, through the changing times. From there, the rules began to change. People who once thought women should only cook now listened, and young girls began to believe their voices had a place. Yet, as her power and fame grew, people became increasingly curious about the man standing next to her, Leif. They grew up together, went through countless life and death together, but never married. They shared everything: food, sleep, wounds, thoughtful afternoons by the river. But there were no vows between them, no elaborate wedding ceremony. They lived together, but freely. They belonged to each other, but did not own each other. Outsiders did not understand, but they did not need to be explained. because there were relationships that did not follow a pattern, but existed like a stream, not tied down but always flowing in the same direction. And then someone tried to break that control. Gorm Blacktooth, a wealthy, arrogant, and ambitious chieftain. During a meeting of the Thing, he stood up, raised his goblet of wine, and said to the council, "A strong woman like you should have a stronger man to guide you. Marry me. I will give you land gold and a name." The air was heavy with the fumes of fermented wine, but she just smiled, stood slowly, and said, her voice low, but each word like a knife cutting through the wind, "If your power comes from owning someone, it is not as strong as my freedom. I do not need to be married. I need to be respected." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Gorm standing there, like a man stripped of his armor in the crowd. From that day on, no one dared to offer marriage as a reward. No one asked her why she had not settled down. She had not chosen that path, for she was on another path. The path of a pioneer. And for those who had ever wondered what a woman could do, the answer was her, Horsefell, who had fallen from her horse with her bare hands, silenced the council with her words, and taught a generation that strength came not from conformity, but from daring to be different. As the morning mist settled over the docks and the sails were still full, she stepped onto the deck like a true leader, not because of the robes or jewels around her neck, but with the calm gaze of a survivor of countless battles. 5 large ships, each carrying 30 elite warriors, a total of 150 lives. Men, women, young and old, seasoned, proud, and skeptical, all under the command of a woman. This was unprecedented in Viking history. No one protested openly, but the heavy silence on deck that morning was her first test. But she did not tremble, did not need to shout or show strength to assert her position. She simply gave orders, each order as neat and precise as a slash in the middle of a battlefield. The days drifting at sea, the wind blowing against their cheeks like burning fire, the meals shared by the weak light of oil lamps, the sleepless nights spent watching the waves. All were led by her with quiet determination. And when they reached the landing site without a shout, the whole team acted as one. Under her command, the assault proceeded as if each step had been etched into their bones. The booty was greater than anyone had anticipated: gold grain horses, slaves, and most importantly, shields and religious icons from enemy lands. But the most valuable thing was not in the crowded hold, but in the eyes of those who had doubted her. When they returned, the wind was still blowing as it had been on the day they had left, but the wind was not as cold. The villagers stood in the harbor waiting. And at the next council meeting, when she entered the circle, everyone rose. No one gave her an order. No one told them to. They simply felt that standing up was the only right thing to do when she appeared. Her fame spread not in ostentatious tales, but like silent ripples from a stone dropped into a deep lake. No longer the sword-wielding girl, no longer just the cavalry killer, but now the leader, the strategist, who not only survived, but inspired others to follow. In the pale yellow light of the afternoon shining through the ravine, she stood silently on the deck, her hands resting lightly on the weather-darkened wooden railing. The wind blew gently through her hair, carrying the scent of the sea, the smell of smoke, and the smell of victory. But she was not drunk on her achievements. In her eyes one saw not arrogance, but an elusive depth, as if she knew that no matter how many spoils of war she could collect, the hardest thing to win was trust. And that was what she had obtained, not with the power of a single slash, but with the quiet steadfastness of someone who knew who she was and where she was going. That winter was more than cold. It was a white curse falling like a silent veil of death upon the village. Snow fell steadily for weeks, burying roofs, blocking paths, turning the forest into a frozen graveyard, where hunters and prey lay motionless beneath a blanket of frost. The wind howled like the wailing of the ancestors, and the village's gazes turned from hope to despair, as the food stocks dwindled, as the livestock turned skeletal and collapsed in their pens, as children began to cry from hunger but had no more tears to shed. Meanwhile, she who had once swung a sword on the battlefield now held a map, listed every bag of grain left, and personally went from house to house to check the situation and plan for famine relief. There was no glory in counting every turnip gathering, every piece of firewood and rationing, every piece of dried meat. But it was a different kind of war, silent, cold, and requiring a deeper endurance than any raid. She organized the hunting party into small groups, divided the forest into zones, selected agile people to scout the way, and strong people to drag the deer carcasses through the deep snow. She coordinated the elderly and women who had never been out of the village to join in baking cakes, sewing winter clothes, and heating water for the sick. Everyone had a part to play, no matter how small, because in a winter like this, no one could just exist. Everyone had to live and help others live. As the situation became more dire, she did not wait for a miracle. She led a group of 20 warriors and dog sleds through more than 100 miles of deep snow to a coastal village where it was rumored that food was still available. The journey took 5 days through blizzards and nights so cold that every breath felt like frost. Several times they were almost lost in the whiteout, but she did not stop, not for herself, but for those left behind. Because she knew that if she took one wrong step, the entire village would be swallowed by the snow. And then one morning, as the sun rose like a pale yellow blur after many gloomy days, her caravan was seen returning. On the wagons were bags of barley-dried fish, animal skins, salt, each seemingly ordinary thing, but at that time more valuable than any booty ever had. Children cheered, adults sobbed, not because they were full, but because they had been saved from the imminent end. The council called a small ceremony in the longhouse, where the old warriors who had wielded axes and slashed through storms rose as she entered, not as a war leader this time, but as a smoldering fire that had warmed the community through the long night. They called her the Keeper of Life, a title that had no sound of swords or shouts, but rang warmer than any song of triumph. From that moment on, people remembered her not only as a sword-wielding warrior, but as a heart still beating in the white snow, a person who understood that victory was not just about overcoming the enemy, but also about holding the last breath for even the weakest people in the village. And in the bitter cold of the eternal winter, she became a source of warmth. ChatGPT said, "In an age when alliances were forged with wedding rings and handshakes between clans, she, a woman of both fame and power, was naturally at the center of political intrigue. After the harsh winter when the village had overcome hunger, and her power had been proven not only by sword, but also by the survival of the community, several Jarl's chieftains from other regions had proposed to her. Some were wealthy, some powerful, some bearing gifts and promises of lasting alliance. But all had one thing in common: They saw marriage as a tool, the way two lands were joined together by a wedding. However, she was not a piece of land to be measured by anyone, nor a prize to be handed over in the hands of men. She knew clearly that if she accepted any proposal, whether from a decent man or an ambitious one, she would lose her hard-won autonomy. Not because love had no place in her heart, but because love, if it existed, must come freely, without strings, without calculation. She turned down each proposal tactfully without offending, but firmly enough to leave no room for doubt. Her words were passed down as a mantra of self-control. I have sworn to Odin that until my task is complete, I shall not marry. For those familiar with Norse beliefs, an oath to a god was no laughing matter. It was not just a shield, but a declaration of the path she was taking, a path that was still unfinished, not yet ready to be shared with anyone else. This rejection, far from weakening her position, earned her respect. People began to see her not as a warrior, but as a shrewd politician who used words instead of swords. Unbound by any family, uncontrolled by any man's ambition, she maintained a neutral position in the intricate web of power in Northern Europe. No one dared to threaten her, nor was anyone wise enough to manipulate her. She was like a knife stuck straight into the table, unwavering, belonging to no one, but always present and oppressive. On long nights when the fog covers the wooden roofs and the barking of dogs echoes from the distant forest, people tell stories about the woman who refused everything, not because she was cold, but because she had a mission greater than love. And in that story, the voice is not raised in awe, but quiet as a lullaby, that sometimes the greatest love is knowing how to wait freely, and sometimes true power lies not in the throne, but in knowing when to say no, and still be heard by the whole world. War, sooner or later, eventually finds those who do not bow. And on a summer red with blood and blazing sunsets, the greatest war of her life broke out. Not over personal ambition, but over two men whose grudges and pride fueled the flames of war. Ivar Blackbeard, a brutal warrior allied with Gorm Blacktooth, whom she had humiliatingly rejected, broke their trade treaties and seized the fjord villages in a public declaration of war. As the news spread, the people panicked. The warriors were furious, and the leaders hesitated. But she, as she had always done, did not panic, did not scream. In the dimly lit conference room, she spread out the map, pointed to the fjord's sinuous lines like burst veins, and said in a voice as deep as the early autumn wind, "We will not wait for them to come to the door. We will get there first." Her plan was unprecedented: to attack the enemy fleet in the middle of the night, when it had dropped anchor, when the campfires had just gone out, and when the enemy himself believed that no one would dare attack in the dark. That night, the small boats without lights silently cut through the waves, like leaves drifting downstream. Each rower held his breath. No one said a word, only the sound of water gently hitting the wooden side, and the sound of the heart pounding in his chest. She sat at the bow of the boat, her armor not glowing her face, not clearly visible, but her eyes were sharp as knives piercing the night mist. As they approached the enemy camp, there were no trumpets, no shouts. Only the sound of weapons drawn from their sheaths, cold and silent as the first snow of the season. The raid was chaotic, but under her command each group moved like a small storm that had been planned in advance. And then, as fate would have it, she came face to face with Ivar Blackbeard, a man who was said to have beheaded 3 men with a single swing of his axe. He was tall, muscular, and his eyes were fierce as a wild beast. But she did not back down. Their duel took place in the flickering light of the fire, amid shouts and the clash of steel. Each blow was the crystallization of a lifetime. He struck with brutal force. She responded with patience, skill, and intuition, as if she could hear the wind whistling across the blade. Finally, with a sharp turn and a dodge, she plunged the knife deep into Ivar's chest, not to kill him, but to warn him. He fell, blood soaking his black cloak, his eyes for the first time not filled with anger, but with confusion, as if he couldn't understand why he had failed a woman. The war ended not with a written treaty, but with a heavy nod from the survivors, that they had lost, and that they would never forget the one who brought them to their knees. From then on, people no longer called her by her name, but by her deeds. The one who extinguished Ivar's campfire. The children listened to the story in the warm tents in the cold winter and wondered, was she afraid when she entered that battle? But the old man only smiled, answering as lightly as the wind. Maybe she was afraid, but she walked towards her fear. And in the long night, everyone's dreams became more peaceful, knowing that such a person once existed, and had conquered not only the enemy, but also prejudice, darkness, and the doubts in their hearts. There are people who spend their whole lives fighting for something: glory, fame, a warm home, or simply to be true to themselves. But only a few, after years of fighting and storms, can overcome it all and become something even greater, a living symbol. She is one of those rare people. From a girl born in a snowstorm, raised between axes and cold, she rose up not by anyone's favor, but by the sword in her hand and a heart that never retreats. In the 30th winter, since she first picked up her sayax, the council bestowed upon her the highest title, Jarl. Not because she was anyone's wife, nor because of any noble blood flowing through her veins, but because everyone agreed that no one was more worthy. In a world where women were often bound by predetermined roles, she stood tall like an oak in a storm. Young warriors, both male and female, sought her out to learn not only how to wield a weapon, but how to stand their ground, how to live meaningfully in a world of constant change. She didn't teach them how to win. She taught them when to fight and when to forgive. She told stories of her own mistakes openly so that young people would understand that strength is not in not falling, but in rising with eyes still forward. Girls from remote villages looked to her as a beacon, proving that they didn't have to give up on themselves, to be accepted, that they could be themselves and still lead, inspire, and be loved. As for Leaf, her friend who had accompanied her since they were children training in the snow, the two chose to live together without a wedding ceremony, without vows to any gods. They called each other by their eyes, by their silence, by simple meals after a long day of training, by the stories they told at night by the fire. That relationship was not bound by titles or seniority. It was like two parallel streams, not overwhelming, not holding back, just flowing side by side until the end of time. And then, on long winter nights, when the wind howls outside and the snow falls like layers of memories, people still gather together in small wooden houses telling the story of a woman. Not as a distant legend, but as a warm part of the community. A person who lived, fought, loved, and led not because she wanted to be remembered, but simply because she could do no other. And so, in the sleep of the next generation, she still appears, not wearing armor, but wearing the gentle light of a person who lived exactly as fate whispered in her ear on that snowy night long ago. A legend in flesh and blood, still walking slowly among the pages of history that have never been closed. As the swords and spears fell silent and battles became tales told by the fire, another conflict quietly arose, one not of swords, but of faith. As merchant ships began to connect distant kingdoms, religion spread with the cargo. Christianity, with its crosses and mournful hymns, slowly crept into coastal villages that had once known only the gods of the north, the Valkyries on horseback, and the flames of cremations rising to the sky. In that wave of change, she, who lived and won by believing in Odin and Freya, in the great gods of her ancestors, did not choose to resist or to submit hastily. She chose to stand on the middle line, a place that required more wisdom than a battle, because at this moment the weapon was no longer the sword or the axe, but a tolerant outlook, and the ability to maintain cultural roots while still opening her arms to the changing world. She allowed Christian traders to dock and priests to build small chapels as long as they did not impose. At the same time, she maintained the rituals of ancestor worship and erected a statue of the god at the highest point of the village as a reminder that roots could not be erased by a new wind. She became a bridge between two worlds, understanding the negotiating spirit of the people who brought the Bible while protecting the sacred spirit of the land she ruled. Many times the villagers doubted her, asking her if it was time to abandon the old gods and embrace the new faith. But she just smiled, her eyes distant, as if seeing something others had not. She said, "We don't have to choose between forgetting or surrendering. We can learn to stand tall, carrying the past in our hearts while still walking toward the future." So, under her reign, children were taught both Norse legends and biblical teachings. The elders still lit torches at Yule, and the young sometimes attended Mass in the cathedral. There were no uprisings, no swords drawn for the faith, for everyone felt the steadfastness of a leader who did not impose, did not deny, but listened and moderated. And when night fell in, the cold sky covered with stars, people still saw her walking alone between two temples. One old, one new. Her eyes were quiet, her hands were bare, as if she carried two worlds within her, without having to choose which one to give up. At that moment, she was no longer a warrior, no longer Jarl, but a bridge, connecting the past with the present, myth with history, and people with their own beliefs. In the rustling wind on the cliffs, people whispered, "Perhaps she is the silent goddess of that era of change." And then in sleep, her story gently drifted into people's hearts like a lullaby of two worlds that were no longer far apart. As time began to fade, her armor and the steel no longer reflected so strongly in her eyes, she did not disappear, nor did she choose to retreat into the shadows like other warriors. Instead, she chose a different way of life, quiet yet bright as the moonlight reflecting on the sea where it all began. Her final years were not tinged with regret, but with meditation, as if she were living between two worlds, that of the earth and that of memories of today and the battles past. She is often seen sitting on a cliff by the sea, sometimes resting her hand on a large stone carved with ancient runic symbols. It is not a tombstone, but a story, an epic in stone, where she records her life not in flowery words, but in simple truth. The words do not list her achievements, do not list her victories, but speak of her choices, of her silence when necessary, and her speaking up when the world would have her keep quiet. She continued to train, but she no longer held a sword. Young women on the cusp of adulthood came to her not to learn how to cut, but how to live. She taught them to look at their enemies with their own eyes, not with anger. She taught them to listen to the wind before they walked, and to listen to their hearts before they struck. In council, she no longer made decisions, but advised sometimes with a simple nod, a look enough to change the course of a long meeting. And then, one autumn afternoon, no one knew when she left. People only saw her light gray cloak placed gently on the stone slab on the shore, the same place where she had first sent her father off to sea, where she had watched the first warship disappear into the mist. No one cried, no one screamed, because in everyone's hearts she had never left. Her story, from a baby girl born in the middle of a snowstorm to a woman sitting silently by the sea, continues to be told. On cold nights, families gather together, and the elderly tell their grandchildren about the woman who silenced the battlefield with her eyes. In the oral sagas, her name appears among the myths, not as a minor character, but as the spirit of an era. And so, even though her body has melted into the ground, she still lives. In the breath of the wind through the long roof, in the sound of the waves crashing on the rocky shore, in the eyes of girls just entering life, their hands not yet accustomed to holding swords, but their hearts burning with desire. A legend that does not exist on paper, but resonates in every heartbeat of those who dare to live a life without compromise, without submission. And in the deep sleep of the night, when all the noise of the world disappears, people still dream of a figure walking on the shore, quiet, steadfast, and immortal.